Hello and welcome to Tank and AFE News. My name's Tom, and today we are looking at a book, as we often do. This one is Stalin's Armour, 1941 to 1945, Soviet Tanks at War by Anthony Tucker Jones. It's published by Pen and Sword. As you can see, this is a hardcover, pretty standard size. It is about 250 pages total, and retails for £25 in the UK or $34.95 in the United States. Of course, you'll probably find it for a little less on some of the online booksellers. So they usually have a discount on these sort of things. So, well, what do we have here? This is obviously a title that is pretty broad. I mean, Stalin's Armour 1941 to 45, Soviet Tanks at War. Could be a lot of different things. So we'll sort of start by listing what it's not. It is not a encyclopedia of Soviet tank types, and as you might find some type of books like that out there. Nor is it a really in-depth examination of Soviet armor from a standpoint of like looking at organization or training or doctrine or that kind of thing. It's more of an overarching history done mainly in chronological style. So it's kind of a combination of the Eastern Front overall with an emphasis on tanks, of course, obviously, and tank development. So sort of a general overview of the topic. This one is, like I said, this is not an illustrated book. It's just pictures. So I'm not going to do the usual thing where I sort of flip through the book so people can see what it's like, because there's not much to see. It's just words. It does have the sort of the standard glossy paper center part with some photos, as these types of books tend to do. So this review isn't going to be super long. And like I say, this is probably going to be a more useful book to somebody who maybe has a fairly decent understanding of the Second World War, but hasn't spent a lot of time on the topic of tanks or the Eastern Front, and is looking for a decent, relatively short, easy-to-read overview of that topic. Like, if you don't want to dive into, a David Glantz book, something like, 500 pages or whatever, but you want kind of an overview of Soviet tank operations on the Eastern Front, this might not be a bad place to start. Now it does, like I said, does focus on some of the tank development issues and touching on how the war affected the different manufacturing sites and how some of those factories were moved around and that sort of thing. Like I said, 250 pages. I mean, not a short book by any stretch, but it's not a very long book for a topic as large as this, particularly when so much time is going to be dedicated to just talking about what was going on in some of these battles in general, sort of on the Eastern Front. As far as the layout of the book, it's pretty much as you would expect. It starts off with, before the war, looking at, sort of giving you an overview of the state of mechanization in the Soviet Army. Obviously it's going to talk about Tukhachevsky. It's also going to talk about some of the people developed in tank development, so Koshkin and the T-34 and that sort of thing. And then it sort of goes through the different major actions and battles of the war. I mean, obviously, when you're talking about armor in the Eastern Front, I mean, tanks and armored divisions are one of the most important units on the field. This is not a niche topic. This is pretty much, part and parcel to the whole way that the front evolved throughout the war. So, toward the end of the book, there is a section at the end here. Here's Socialist Labor. It looks at some of the individual, sort of brief stories of some of the individual Soviet tank crewmen, which is kind of interesting. And then an appendices where it just lists sort of year by year the different units without really giving much description. So you can sort of see that here, just a list of unit names. And then the second appendix is just a list of the different brief descriptions of the different types of Soviet tanks used. And so that's really about it. I don't have a lot to say about this book other than, it just sort of is what it is. And the other thing, looking at the bibliography, because I always go to bibliographies first when I look at a book, and the impression I got when I was reading this as well is that I don't know if this was written necessarily using a lot of the latest research in the topic. In the last 20 years, there's been a lot of interesting new stuff written, particularly by Russian writers or other writers who have had access to some of the archival materials from the old Soviet archives that obviously were not accessible during the Cold War. And so there's been quite a bit of, sort of what gets labeled revisionist history on the topic, particularly the Eastern Front. And going through the bibliography here, those very few Russian names I see, and it's a lot of the sort of the names you would expect to see, people who've written some of the major works on the Eastern Front, like Anthony Beaver, and of course Glantz is in here, and some other people. But like I said, I don't see some of the newer work. So example, like Zamelin, who's done some interesting stuff on Kursk in the last few years. Kavalichik, I'm never sure exactly how to pronounce that one, but this book that I reviewed a year or two ago, which is excellent, on the history of the tanks of Operation Barbarossa. This one by Yesov on the Battle of Dubno in 1941, which, I mean, this book that I'm reviewing today doesn't even really talk about this. They now think this is probably the largest tank battle in World War II. It's just that it's in that first week of Operation Barbarossa, so the Russians didn't want to talk about it because they lost a ridiculous number of tanks. And from the German perspective, it just kind of became part of those series of successful envelopment battles, so it just really didn't get a lot of attention post-war in the things. And instead, everybody talks about Kursk being the largest tank battle. And so, for example, I did mark this page. So, like, this paragraph kind of jumped out at me. It was at Prokhorovka that the T-34 bested the Tiger and Panther. This was achieved by the tanks of the 5th Tank Army engaging the Panzers at very close range in order to fire on their side and rear armor. The German 4th Panzer Army lost 300 Panzers, including 70 Tigers, at Prokhorovka. So right there, those numbers are sort of like the ones that I remember seeing it when I was a kid in some of the books, from the 70s and the 80s on the topic. And I think more recent scholarship has shown, so like in this book here, where he actually has lists of the tanks available to the German 4th Panzer, and they didn't even have 70 Tigers at that battle as far as what's in there. So I think some of the sources and materials that this book was used when being written are a little tired, frankly. I'll put it that way. That said, like I said, if somebody's looking for an overview of Soviet armor and how it was used and its role in the Eastern Front in World War II, this is not a bad starting off point. It's okay. I guess that's all I can say. Did this one blow me away? No. It's what it is. All right. Well, thank you, and we'll catch you on the next one.